虎の遺作。
それは違くねえか。
This is really awkward without music. I'm just not gonna lie. What's not so awkward is this meatball recipe that Yuji discloses at the end of the final episode, so, spoilers. Now the first thing you want to do is gather your ingredients for your nabemono. I'm using some King Oyster mushrooms, some Japanese green onions, some regular scallions, a giant honkin' carrot. Look at this thing, it's massive. One shallot that we're not actually going to use, 1/2 head of Napa cabbage, 1 pack of white beach mushrooms, a little bit of bok choy, some beautiful shiitake mushrooms that I found locally, and really any other vegetables you want to add. First up is the carrot, so make sure you peel it really well, and we're gonna slice this on a nice thick bias so that way you get these really beautiful rondelles out of them. The carrot doesn't need to be cut too thick, otherwise it will take a long time to cook and it won't become tender inside of your soup. The Japanese green onion I'm going to cut on the same size of bias. The reason why I want to cut it on a bias is because if you just go ahead and start slicing this super thin, you won't have these nice bigger pieces of your green onion. When you cut things on a bias, you create more surface area and you end up having these really beautiful chunks of onion, carrot, really whatever you're working with. The head of this green onion is going to be used in the soup later. I ended up using both of my stalks of green onion, but that's totally going to be up to the size of your nabemono. Now I am using Baby Bok Choy, but feel free to use regular bok choy if you have it available. You're going to treat it the same way where you trim off the ends and make sure that the insides are really clean. Now I am using firm tofu for my tofu of choice because it holds up really well in soup. You want to cut this into about 1-inch size pieces all the way around. This gives you a nice chunky bit of tofu to work with. And also make sure you throw a little bit of salt on a piece and have it as a snack. Now for the King Oyster mushrooms, all you really need to do for this is trim off the ends and then slice them in half. If you have really big mushrooms like I have on this one, you can slice these into thirds just to make sure that they are super even. Now for the white beach mushrooms, all you really need to do is hold the tops of the mushrooms and slice off the bottom of that entire stem. Once you do that, you're pretty much done with those mushrooms. Now for the Napa cabbage, we are going to treat this as 2 individual pieces of vegetable. The reason why I say that is because around 2/3 of the way up on your cabbage, you have these really thick ribs of cabbage. This does take longer to cook than the top of the leaves, so do keep these separate so that way when you add them to your soup, you add them at different times. For the green onions or the scallions, I am slicing these super thin, and instead of adding these to the meatball, I'm going to use these as a garnish only because we did have someone in the house who just really couldn't eat the green onions. Now for the shiitake mushrooms, I'd like to make sure I clean these with just a damp cloth. You don't need to run these under water or anything like that, and actually that's the worst way to do them. And we just need to clean up the stems of the shiitake mushrooms. Once you clean up all the stems on your mushrooms, place these into a separate container and leave them whole. So Itadori said to use ginger paste, but instead I'm going to use twice as much fresh ginger. And to make sure that this ginger really incorporates itself into these meatballs, I'm going to peel them back, and then what we're going to do with this ginger is we're going to grate this with a microplane. I'm also using equal parts chicken breast and dark meat or chicken thigh. We're using 500 grams of each. Now grate your ginger over a bowl with your microplane, making sure you get all that good off the bottom because it does like to pile up and you don't want to lose any of that. Once you have around 100 grams worth of grated ginger, add that to your chicken meat, grab yourself a couple of eggs, and we are going to separate these. You can keep these eggs whole if you would really like, but if you're going to use whole eggs, just use 1 whole egg rather than 2, otherwise your mixture will be really wet. Season this generously with salt and a ton of black pepper, and once you have this seasoned, make sure you give it a nice spooning so all those flavors start really incorporating themselves together. After you've created your little turkey paste, place a small amount of it in a nice high heat pan to taste this for seasoning. This is a super important step, and if you don't do this, you may lack any salt or pepper content that you really want. After giving it a taste, mine needed a good amount more salt, so I went ahead and seasoned it one more time, gave it a good stir, and I grabbed myself a 3/4 ounce scooper. This just makes your life so much easier, and I highly recommend you get a scooper of at least 1 or 2 different sizes. For when you're doing things like meatballs or cookies, it just makes everything so much easier. After scooping all of your meatballs, Paul stopped doing that. Grab your nabe and let's get ready to cook off some of this beautiful meatballs. This nabemono I picked up just for this and I absolutely love it. Now I am using chicken stock for this that I picked up locally. It's a really nice organic chicken stock, but feel free to just use dashi. My nabe actually held around 2 liters worth of stock, so that's what I ended up using. Your mileage is going to vary on how much liquid you need. Bring this over to the stove stove and place this over a medium heat to get it going, and then grab your giant platter of vegetables. While everything is heating up, add 50 milliliters of soy sauce, 50 milliliters of mirin, and 50 milliliters of sake, and just give it a quick stir to make sure everything is playing really nicely together. Now, after letting this heat up for around 5 to 10 minutes, we're going to add in some of our harder vegetables first. So the first thing I'm going to add is the carrots, and then realize that I added way too much stock to this, so I ended up removing around 500 milliliters. Once I've removed some of my stock, I started placing all of my meatballs directly into the nabe. You want to be super careful with this because not only is it hot, but these are a ton of meatballs. I was able to fit all of my meatballs in my nabe, but you may not be able to because this is just a lot of meatballs. After letting these simmer for around 10 minutes, I added in the bottom portion of my napa cabbage, my King Oyster mushrooms, my tofu, my Japanese green onions, then the shiitake mushrooms right in the middle just to make it look as pretty as possible, a few leaves of my bok choy, and it was getting super crowded. The last thing I had to add were some of my white beech mushrooms, and I just placed those directly in the middle and let this simmer for just a couple of minutes on the stove. Now, while this was simmering for just a few minutes, I did set up a really nice station over in the living room. I grabbed myself one of my burners, placed my nabe directly over the burner, making sure it was out of frame, accompanied it with rice, some chopsticks, a few soup spoons, some soy sauce, and those green onions we are using as garnish since they're not in the meatballs. I plated myself a small bowl of this with my mushrooms, my cabbage, a few meatballs, some of my tofu, and finally some of those green onions. There's guys, the ginger chicken meatball nabemono from Jujutsu Kaisen. This was super easy to put together, and I will say the vegetables I kind of went overboard a little bit, as you could probably tell from me like removing them halfway through the cooking process, but the meatballs came out super nice. This is really what I'm looking forward to, so cheers. There's so much ginger. It's really bright. The one thing with the meatballs is even though they taste really nice, they kind of fall apart a little bit without any binder. So maybe if you were to throw in some breadcrumb or even some cooked rice, it would work really well. But other than that, they're really freaking good. Yeah. Remember, the broth itself, feel free to add whatever you want to this. Just like you should feel free to check out the merch down below. My name is CHEFPK. Get subscribed. Remember, keep playing with your food. All right, we're gonna go watch episode 13 again.